Welcome William H.G. Carter in Cincinnati in 1938 when he started Brotherhood Church. Or it might have been different at the Universalist Mission Church in Suffolk, had survived Joseph Fletcher Jordan's death in 1929. As former UUA President Bill Sinkfoot observes, lack of diversity is the greatest obstacle to creating more diversity. Kind of obvious. Diversity in the Unitarian Universalist context has advanced more quickly has progressed more quickly when the primary barrier to inclusivity is not culture, but gender or sexual orientation. And history from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, novelist, poet, activist, to Harvard-educated Bill Sinkford, shows that the people of color who become Universalists or Unitarian, or more recently Unitarian Universalists, have always been those who operated within our white, liberal, cultural norms. It bears repeating that while we may no longer be upper-class Bostonians, we are still an upper-middle-class religion. We are still an ethnic-like faith. So the difficulty, and why Unitarian Universalists keep getting it wrong, is that who we are conflicts with who we aspire to be. Now, in that same 1987 Commission on Appraisal survey that I talked about, embracing diversity ranked very high as a priority. Indeed, whenever diversity is advocated, what do? We salute. It's apostasy to do otherwise. In 2007, Bill Sinkford wrote in the UU world that he hears among UUs a deep sense of failure, and for himself to sing "We Shall Overcome" felt like a lie. Why? Because we aren't as diverse as many wish. Therefore, Bill went on to announce the UUA Diversity of Ministry team was outlining a plan for welcoming the 42 seminarians, that's 60 now, 42 seminarians preparing for our ministry who are persons of color, Latino, Latina, Hispanic people. What is it we aspire to be? Now, if our congregations had large population of people who used American Sign Language, wouldn't that be great? Of course. But that's not what we mean when we say diverse. Wouldn't it be great if we even attracted a handful, UUA and Cherokee and Navajo and other Native Americans and Inuit and Métis and Filipinos and Pacific Islanders and Latina, Hispanic peoples, and of course, Caribbeans and other persons of the African diaspora, and whoever else I had missed. We would not finish the sentence until tomorrow. This attention to naming looms large, and the awkwardness of the nomenclature reflects a kind of awkward relationship. People want to have their cultural identities recognized, honored, respected in a way they have not been. So in a denomination that first and foremost respects the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we try. We are awkward, in part, because we are afraid of offending. That fear makes us, cautious. And being cautious, rather looking for offense or fearful of offending, makes for stilted conversations, hesitant relationships. There's this voice in the back of our mind that whispers, "It will be over soon." As we scan ahead for cultural landmines. So we alternate between tiptoeing cautiously and stumbling along. Who we are isn't who we want to be, and the way we're going about addressing this challenge isn't working as fast as we wish. We know it when we look around the room at UU gatherings, and what do we see? Well, it lacks the racial and cultural diversity, certainly where we are now. The reality that we do not reflect this world in which we're living and which is quickly emerging, but it calls what? It calls our liberality into question. Many feeling a vague sense of discomfort, worry, and ask, why? Why? When we have such good intentions and we try so hard, can't we change? Some not seeing their multicultural families reflected are frustrated. Others not seeing others like themselves ache. The numbers, not our hopes, not our wishes, not our impatience, indicate they're having change. The numbers of female and LGBTQ ministers simply have moved toward reflecting the percentage in our UU population. The same is true of ministers of color. Adding the handful of other ministers of color to the African American ministers, it looks like this. Over the past 70 years, the number of ministers of color serving congregations grew from 5 to 8 to 21 to around 60. In other words, not congregation, but serving. In other words, it is more than doubled around every 15, 16, 17 years. This increase happened throughout the 40s and the 50s when it was nearly impossible to settle an African American, in the 60s when we marched in Selma and then scrambled to respond to Black power, during the re-entrenchment of the 70s, finding our feet again in the 80s in regard to race relations, or in the middle of the current anti-racism, anti-oppression, multicultural effort. This suggests that the determining factor is not our indifference, not our efforts, or our fretting. In fact, it may have to do with the UUA and what we do. The characteristics of African Americans that have been drawn to liberal religion are obvious. From Ethelred Brown, who started the church in Harlem in 1920, to Yvonne Sion, who in 1981 became the first African American woman ordained, they are were and are independent-minded, critical thinking mavericks, or they would not have chosen Unitarian Universalism. From Fannie Berry Williams to the Reverend Louis McGee, they are refugees from other faith traditions, and particularly in practice of living in both white and Black worlds. From William H.G. Carter to David Eaton, they are progressive, socially concerned, engaged individuals that differ from other UUs by having inherited via Black suffering a deep and ingrained understanding that salvation, though this was what Michael was trying to tell us, salvation is a collective reality in which we leave no one behind. And from Don Smith Goodloe in Towson, Maryland, to Annie B. Willis in Suffolk, they have been individuals who placed education before all else. All these women and men dedicated themselves to the good of the Black community, but not always to its social and theological dictates. Of this cluster of qualities, being independent-minded, critical thinking, culturally ambidextrous activists, the one most easily tracked is education. Repeatedly, surveys tell us that education is an indicator that correlates strongly with being a Unitarian Universalist. And I do not wish to conflate having a inquiring approach to life with education, but the one I can track, the other not. The average academic attainment among Unitarian Universalists is 17.2 years. Okay? That's about the equivalent of a master's degree. In 1940, 1% of African Americans over 25 held a bachelor's degree. By 2004, that had increased to 17.6%. In 1940, there were two African American ministers, Jeffrey Campbell and Egbert Ethelred Brown. By 2004, that had increased to 27. If you plot the increase of African American ministers, African Americans with BA degrees, alongside the increase of the number of African American ministers, the number of ministers lags just behind this upward curve. That's what we see, is we actually track right behind the education level of African Americans. This trend seems to apply to other people of color and Latino, Latina, and Hispanic peoples as well. The first Latino minister was John Burciaga, who was fellowshipped in 1962. Patricia Jimenez was fellowshipped in 1994. And there are now currently around 16 Hispanic ministers. And if you track that, that's a doubling of about once every 11 years. Speaking in 1998, Patricia said, take, for example, the three of us, Latinos, Latinas, speaking on this panel. All three of us come from other faith traditions. All three of us have graduate degrees. We are all professionals. We fit the profile of a lot of UUs. In addition, we all speak English. What I do suggest is that here among the educated, professional, and bilingual Latinos and Latinos is a good place to start. So anecdotally, quantitatively, historically, demographically, the story is the same. What happened? What happened? Over the past 70 years, the makeup of the group our congregations draw from changed. With the growth of the African American and Hispanic middle class, the substantial increase in the number of people of color graduating from college, the growth in the number of mixed marriages, and the children of those marriages, a group that is overwhelmingly middle class, we changed. Why? Because we are an ethnic-like faith community, and those individuals came to fit into our Unitarian Universalist culture. The growth has been incremental, but the numbers indicate it will continue regardless of what we Unitarian Universalists do or don't do. Rather than leading, we are mirroring a changing, evolving society. In the 1987 Commission on Appraisal Survey, it not only did embracing diversity rank as third highest factor in being a vital congregation, it also ranked second lowest in being met. 20 years later, Bill Sinkford was still hearing that we feel a deep sense of failure in this regard. Why the fretting? Why the anxiety? Well, Unitarian Universalists, we have